Hey everyone, welcome back to Reason and Theology, joined by Dr. Gabriel Reynolds, returning guest, professor, and author, and also Louis Dizon, who's going to be co-hosting this show with me today. Dr. Reynolds, welcome back to the show. How have you been?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm really delighted to be here, and yeah, thanks for putting up with me one more time.
No, it is such an
Mm.
honor to always have you on. You're an outstanding academic, and I really appreciate your content and really excited to talk to you about your upcoming book. I understand it's coming out in September, Christianity and the Qur'an,
Right.
the Rise of Islam in Christian Arabia. So this is going to be a fascinating topic. Tell me a little bit about this.
Well, I mean, it's a provocative title intentionally because the argument is itself provocative. The traditional idea is that Islam emerged more or less in the midst of sort of like a pagan culture. The pagan darkness. You may know the Arabic Islamic word for the pre-Islamic period is jahiliyyah, which literally means like the age or the realm of ignorance. So this presents, Islam as this like brilliant light emerging out of the darkness of idolaters and pagans and all sorts of, other sort of vices that the pre-Islamic Arabs had. And there's a lot of evidence that is now turning up that actually that's either partially or completely wrong. In fact, that Christianity had spread even to Mecca and Medina by the time Muhammad started his prophetic career.
There was I think there was a person who worked in Mecca. I forget what his job description was, but common man who was known to be a Christian, and I think he's actually mentioned in the Quran. And there's a reference to whether Muhammad got his information about the Bible from him.
Yeah, great, 100%. So the traditional stories speak of a man named Waraqa ibn Nawfal, who in these narrations is the cousin of Muhammad's first wife, who was Khadija, and he's said to be a Christian. I mean, there's so many directions this could go, right? Because, you know, what kind of Christian would this guy have been? But actually, in the book, I sort of set those traditions aside.
Okay.
So those traditions, show up in the Islamic literature, and in my humble opinion, which is usually right, uh, that those traditions are sort of constructed for Islamic apologetics. So the book, like my book, Christianity and the Quran, does not sort of depend on those medieval Islamic works which speak of
Okay.
a Christian here or there, because if you read them all together, that's really the impression you get, that there's like some Christian passes through Mecca, a small community of Christians shows up to speak with Muhammad in Medina. A
Mm-hmm.
couple of Muslims went across the Red Sea to speak with some Christians in Ethiopia, but it's just here and there. And what I'm suggesting is radically different, that
Well,
from non-Islamic sources, so principally inscriptions, along with a careful, attentive reading of the Quran, not the narrations, not the stories, but the Quran, the scripture, one can hold something much more profound, which was Arabia was Christian at this time.
and setting aside maybe later references to Christians in the Hijaz, what about? I think there's a figure who's mentioned who was perhaps, I believe, a Christian blacksmith that is mentioned in the Quran. Do you touch on that?
Yeah, so great, terrific questions. I mean, we have this one verse in the Quran, it's chapter 16, verse 103, which speaks of a person. The Arabic word is bashar. So it speaks of some person, and it says that he has a foreign tongue,
Oh,
and that's all it says.
oh,
The Quran there is a very kind of typical, very Quran style passage where it's sort of God affirming, sending a message to Muhammad, which of course it's in the Quran, so it's sort of meant to be heard by everyone. It's pretty complicated to think through, but that
mhm.
that verse says, "Listen, we know that they say that Muhammad only gets his information from this person with a foreign tongue." But this scripture is perfect Arabic, more or less, clear Arabic. So consequently, it cannot be dependent on this guy with a foreign tongue or foreign language. And then, just to kind of complete the circle, later Islamic commentaries have different ideas about who this person might have been. And a very common one is that it was some Christian blacksmith in Mecca, because this chapter, chapter 16, and Nahl in Arabic, is thought to have been revealed or proclaimed in Mecca. So there's this idea, oh, well, there was this one Christian guy, he was a blacksmith. Muhammad would walk by there. He would proclaim his Christian stuff in his own language. So these accusations started appearing, but the Quran refutes them. So, I mean, those sorts of stories from the commentaries, I would take with a grain of salt.
And the story about the Mubahala, is that also kind of a later story, or is there ancient pedigree to it, or early
Great.
pedigree
I would
to it?
also see it as, yeah, a later story. It's okay if I say just really briefly what
Sure.
that's about. Yeah, great reference, really important. And it's really important that you raise these, because these are the stories which time and again come up, for example, in Muslim Christian dialogue.
Hmm.
So just endlessly by both Christians and Muslims.
Right.
I mean, Christians like these stories too, like official dialogue, Catholic, Muslim, and other Christian Muslim dialogues, they bring up these stories. So the Mubahala is a good example, because the story says that Muhammad was doing his thing in Medina, and then a group of Christians came from a city that was largely Christian in the south of Arabia called Najran. And the Christians showed up, and they Muhammad was very gracious, magnanimous with them, allowed them even to pray in his mosque.
Hmm.
So you can see why Christians in dialogue
Hmm.
would like this, because it's a sign of, like, magnanimity that today Muslims and Christians could, follow, emulate. But then the story goes that these Christians, had a conversation with Muhammad, and they said to him, "Listen, who do you say the father? You say Jesus was not the Son of God. Who do you say his father is?" And then, Muhammad, in these occasions, he often waited for the angel Gabriel to give him revelations, which would give sort of the clear divine response to his opponents. And so he gets a revelation which says, well, listen, Jesus was just like Adam. Jesus didn't have a human father. Adam didn't have a human father. And in neither case does it mean that they're divine. I'll wrap this up really quickly. Sorry, I'm going on too long. It
Oh,
all
you're
ends
fine.
up, though,
Take your time. Take your time.
yeah, I mean, it all ends up with Muhammad and the Muslims saying, listen, it's actually connected to the Quran, but listen, let's just have some sort of ordeal. And that's the word you referenced there, some mubahala. We'll have some ordeal. So some of your viewers might know the story of Saint Francis in Egypt.
Right.
Kind of similar thing there, but there it's Francis who makes the challenge. Have
Yeah.
some sort of ordeal so we can decide who is a liar and who is truthful. And the Christians back down because they know deep down in their hearts Muhammad really is a prophet. Anyway, so the whole story, it's only in the later commentaries. There is, like, it's connected to a word that appears in Quran 3. Ibtahala is the verb, and that's where you get this noun mubahala. Um, and yeah, so it's again the sort of story that emerged through speculation on some pretty vague references in the Quran, and I don't consider it to be a historical account.
I have a ton of questions. I'm only going to ask one more right now before I pass it over to Lewis, because he has way more insightful questions than I will ever ask. So, but I want to ask one more before maybe we come back to me, and I'll ask maybe a few more, wrapping it up at the end. Um, so I think one of the claims that I hear is that one of the proofs of Muhammad's prophethood is that he knew in great detail um, certain things from Christianity and Judaism, certain biblical stories, and maybe even things from the Talmud.
Mhm.
And it's and there's a lot of question on how he would have had access to this. One thing that I've seen some people say in response to the proofs of prophethood argument is that, well, perhaps previously, prior to his ministry, he engaged as a trader, and so he would encounter people through trade, and whenever you do that, they'll maybe have stories, and maybe the people that he was talking to weren't scholars, but maybe they were, getting some of these stories and details from their priests and monks,
Right,
and
right.
then kind of passing that on to him. I don't know if that would account for that level of detail and just those kinds of conversations, but I have seen that. What do you think of that response?
Yeah, so that's a really great point because it's a key argument in Islamic apologetics or dawah, right? That the Quran has all of this information. I mean, it actually goes beyond sort of biblical stories, right, to
Right.
science, and it gets kind of to some wild places. Quran has this and that bit of information, but listen, Muhammad was an illiterate man, far away from the great sort of centers of culture and civilization in the Fertile Crescent, way down there in Mecca and Medina. And he was illiterate. He had no access to this sort of stuff. This is not a new argument. You find this in the medieval Islamic Arabic writings. So that he knows these things shows that he's a prophet. The Quran actually is already doing that. It's already making that argument. So more than one. So one example is elsewhere in Quran 3, the Quran alludes to a story which is connected to traditions of how Joseph became engaged to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And, this is a story that shows up in the Proto-Evangelium of James.
Right.
And, there's different miracles involved and stuff like that. So the Quran has its own version of that story. And then it says, again, we're listening in to God speaking to Muhammad, which is really interesting in terms of a literary device. So God says to Muhammad, you weren't there when they threw their pens. In the Quran, the story involves pens. You weren't there when they threw their pens. So the Quran already is sort of, modeling this kind of argument, maybe suggesting to its audience that this is a way to argue for the new prophet. So there's lots of stories in later sources as well, or lots of arguments about these stories to say, on this basis, we know that Muhammad had a divine source. So yeah, it's a really big trend. The argument of the book is basically, not to get involved in any way with polemics or apologetics. It's just sort of a historical study. But the argument is simply that, well, you didn't have to go far. You didn't have to be a trader or a merchant who went up to Syria or Palestine or south to Yemen or something. No, Christianity was all around Mecca and Medina.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to pass it over here to Lewis. Like I said, he has way more insightful questions than I'm going to have, so I'm just going to be here eavesdropping, and then maybe I'll just come at the tail end and ask a few final follow-up questions. Lewis, passing it over to you.
All right, excellent. So, this is kind of my wheelhouse because I have done quite a bit of study on this topic. In fact, one of the first questions that I want to pose is the relationship of your work to the work of previous scholars who have done
Right.
some similar stuff. So I want to start off by mentioning, a rather controversial book. So almost anyone in early Islamic studies is familiar with the book by Patricia Crona and Michael Cook, Hagarism, back in the 70s. And I remember, if I recall correctly, Crone and Cook had a very similar thesis to what you're arguing. They were saying even back then that, a lot of what develops into Islam is heavily influenced by pre-existing religions. So they talked about how early Islam was initially influenced by Judaism, and then they were influenced by the Samaritan sect, and they're influenced by Christianity.
Yeah.
And at the time, there was a lot of pushback against that kind of thesis. But it seems that in recent years, at least parts of the original Hagarism thesis is being vindicated. Would you think that would be a fair assessment?
No, I mean, in terms of like the reception of Hagarism, I mean, it's still a sort of almost a toxic topic in the world of academics, because it's, as you know, Luis, it's tied up with a discourse around sort of colonialism and Orientalism. So it's seen like to even like once I just mentioned, you may know, like the book was never reprinted, no second edition never came out, and so it's like insanely expensive to get the hardcover version. And so once I just mentioned on Twitter, I was like, guys, it's been pirated. If someone wants to read it, and I explicitly said in the tweet, this is not a recommendation of Hagarism. And nevertheless, I was attacked over this and called names and stuff like this. So it's still a toxic term. And even people who work, like as I try to, the best I can, in a historical critical mode, it's still seen as just kind of a failed experiment. Famously, one of the two authors, Patricia Crone, God rest her soul, has passed away. The other author has disavowed the book, Michael Cook, who's still amazingly still working at Princeton. Yeah, the difference between Hagarism and what I'm doing here is really, really profound, because as you know, Hagarism is a sort of thought experiment, meant to be provocative. It basically says, listen, if we just set aside all of the Islamic historical narratives, and we just look at the sort of arguments, or better, the sort of narratives that seem to inform how the Qur'an thinks about religion, God, and humanity, we can explain it in this and that way. So, and they turn to non-Islamic sources to make their case. And it develops this very specific historical narrative, just as you said. First you have, the Hagarenes, this idea based on Genesis 21, that Hagar went out into the wilderness. So there's this idea that the Jews informed some of the Arabs about the story of Genesis 21. And the Arabs were like, oh, this is cool. We can kind of use this for our own purposes. And then it kind of takes off from there. And it's very specific, almost conspiratorial. In the preface of that book, they say something like, this is a book by infidels for infidels. So, I mean, it's not like a sober, careful analysis of the data. So this book, Christianity and Quran, is actually not saying in any way that Muhammad or the early believers were somehow aligned with or emerging out of the Christianity of the Middle East. On the contrary, my conviction is that this is a response to Christianity. So maybe I'll leave it at there for now.
Yes. Well, based on what you said, I was also going to mention a more recent work. You're also familiar, doubtless, with Donner and his, Islam as a monotheistic believers movement. So I'm guessing you wouldn't necessarily accept that theory either.
So there's a lot of good in that book. There's some things I definitely disagree with, but there are really, really important points in that book. So, he's been really taken to task for this idea that, in the early movement, which he calls just as you said, the believers movement, not the Islamic movement, right? So his idea is that, basically it was ecumenical. It's probably the wrong adjective used there, but, basically included Jews and Christians. And he has different, he's very careful. He's a great scholar. He has different sort of arguments he uses to advance that case that Jews and Christians were part of this movement. And some of the arguments he makes, I think, are valid, but not all of them. And I don't agree with the final step of putting this all together so that you have this, harmonious coexistence of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. However, the larger point, which is very Donner, namely that Islam takes time to become Islam, right? So part of the book is not just, everyone always thinks about, it's the ecumenical nature. That's what Donner is interested in. Well, he's also interested in the later development of Islam as Islam, right? The move from the believers movement to the Islamic movement, which he holds really takes place towards the end of the Umayyad period. So I think that's an important insight, and I think I can make different arguments about why that probably is the case.
Okay, yeah, so that makes sense. So moving on to some other material. So I want to zero in mainly on the idea of Christian, like pre-existing Christian knowledge in the Quran and among the early Muslims. So in my conversations with a lot of Muslims, many of them seem to be averse to the idea that the Quran contains pre-existing knowledge. Like their belief is Muhammad must have arrived at these by direct revelation, and he previously didn't know them. There's this one particular ayah in Surah Hud that they will quote in defense of this idea, and I want maybe you can speak to this. It's in ayah 49 of Surah Hud, where it says, these are the stories of the unseen which we reveal to you. Neither you nor your people knew this before it. So it's almost saying that you had no idea of these stories up until the point in which it was revealed to you, or at least that's how it's normally interpreted.
Yeah, this is Quran 11, right? Hud is 11, I think, right? So I mean, that's the heart of the matter in some ways, Luis, right? And those verses are really key for the way they unlock the let's say, agenda is kind of a pejorative word, but the hopes of the Quran's author, the effect he wants to achieve on his audience, right? So, from a historical point of view, this is, precisely the sort of thing you would see in religious literature when you're hoping to make the case that you have access to divine knowledge, and in this case specifically, you're making the case for this new prophet who should have his place, alongside Moses and Jesus. That's the sort of thing that you would want to sort of inculcate in your audience, right? So the Quran is not in a matter-of-fact way reporting the life of Muhammad. The Quran is a book with an argument. Its principal concern, above all, is to defend Muhammad's prophethood. The principal case that it makes for Muhammad's prophethood is not that he performed supernatural miracles. The principal case is that he provided information that he shouldn't have known about, but he did. Maybe the Quran is also already invested in sort of the surpassing beauty, transcendent beauty of its Arabic. That, for me, that's a little more iffy, but forget about that for a second. So therefore, these sorts of passages, like the one around the engagement of Joseph to Mary in Quran 3, that's sort of the whole point of the Quran. So from a historian's point of view, those verses are interesting, not because they somehow prove that things came from heaven and not from some other source, but because they help us understand the nature of this document as an argument for Muhammad. I mean, what would a modern parallel be? Like someone who's convinced that Elon Musk is a genius. This is not my sort of territory, so someone might correct me in the comments, but let's just say, let's roll with it. Someone who's convinced that Elon Musk is a genius might want to emphasize that, he didn't go to this or that school, as a kid in South Africa, I think, he didn't have access to this or that book, and yet look what he's done, right? So, and because you want to elevate Elon Musk as the great man who has this sort of natural intrinsic genius, right? You would build that case. So that's more or less what the Quran is up to in such passages.
Okay. Yeah, that would make sense. So you could say that there's an apologetic motive for downplaying the presence of Jews and Christians in Arabia, and more specifically in Mecca.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is, and it's not something that is imposed upon the Quran. It's something that's already there in the Quran. So we can see that already at the time, what scholars would call the Zitzim Leben, to use a really fancy, annoying term, at the time when the Quran is being composed, which may not necessarily be the same time as the Prophet Muhammad's career, right? So in that time and place when the Quran is being composed, this is a concern, which suggests already that there's a debate out there, right? There are people out there. Some people are saying, yeah, this guy was a prophet. Other people are saying, nah, I don't think so. And so therefore, in the composition of this text, that line is, comes up again and again to make a case. Now in the, with this sort of theatrical presentation of a conversation between God and Muhammad.
Okay. And then with regards to the evidence, on your YouTube channel, your most viewed set of interviews I notice are the ones that you had with Ahmed Al-Jalad and
Yes.
his work on epigraphic inscriptions in Arabia. And I know that that is a key piece of evidence on which you build your argument. So maybe you could summarize, like, what have been the insights that you gleaned from his work?
Yeah, it's absolutely critical to the book, to Christianity and the Qur'an, but also to understanding just generally the emergence of Islam, and the history of the Arab people was or Arabic-speaking people, I should say, was very, very key. So, I mean, in brief, and it's not only Ahmed, but Ahmed is a superstar. So it's great to give him as much sort of cred and attention as we can. But collectively with some other scholars, including Leila Nami, Michael McDonald, Christian Robin, but Ahmed above all, they've shown really convincingly just an astounding, Robert Hoyland, also I should mention him, a really astounding fact about the pre-Islamic Arabic language inscriptions in Arabia, namely that the pagan inscriptions disappear around the year 500. So by the end of the 5th century, zero paganism in the inscriptions, no reference to pagan gods, no reference to pagan goddesses, no reference to any sort of pagan ritual. In their place, you then have inscriptions which are in a distinct Arabic script, which is called Paleo-Arabic. I mean, so other terms have been used, but people seem to accept this one now. Paleo-Arabic, they are all monotheistic. Not only that, but those that can be identified further are all Christian. So basically, not Jewish. They're either just vaguely, blandly monotheistic, or they're explicitly Christian. So in the book, I speak about a revolution before the revolution of Islam. There's a revolution somewhere in the late 5th century. Pagan inscriptions disappear, Christian inscriptions appear, and then, of course, in the 7th century, you have the revolution of Islam.
Okay, so most of your you're basically extrapolating from the fact that references to paganism were declining as time goes on. Is that correct?
Yeah, declining and then completely disappear. It's not like there's a few of them left in the 6th or 7th century. There's zero.
Okay, so I do have a couple of follow-up questions with regards to that particular line of evidence. The one has to do with the idea of survivorship bias. So, it's hard to extrapolate what is the most common thought based on inscriptions, because maybe there were other streams of thought in the area that were just as common, but just weren't as well written about. So perhaps the pagans were around, but they just weren't necessarily writing about themselves or their religion. The other question I have has to do with the lack of evidence in Mecca proper, because my understanding is a lot of these inscriptions, they were found in like the deserts several hundred miles out from Mecca, but they're not found in Mecca proper. It's kind of hard to excavate Mecca because of the holy sites there. So, we have a distinct lack of evidence of what the religious milieu in Mecca specifically would have been like. So we still have to go by the Islamic sources, and the Islamic sources paint the picture in Mecca as, it's this pagan hub with all these idols.
With idols.
Yeah. And then almost no Jews or Christians at all.
Correct. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, great questions or pushback. On the first point, I concede that, it's at least in terms of the suggestion I make of the disappearance of paganism, that's not a compelling suggestion or compelling argument, right? Because just because, there's no more inscriptions, that's just absence of something, but it doesn't mean that there are no pagans there. it's an argument from silence. So good pushback on that. The answer, which is more by way of providing a second piece of suggestive evidence, but again, not compelling, it doesn't necessarily follow that there's no pagans left. But the other piece of suggestive evidence is, of course, the Qur'an itself. And we could speak more about that. And we've spoken about it before, and you know this very well, Luis. And yeah, so, I mean, the Qur'an itself has a really shocking interest in Christianity, not only in biblical stories, but in Christianity and in Christians, not in some vague way, but in Christian monks, in Christian priests, in Christian monasteries and cloisters, in even the good qualities of Christians for their humility. So it's engaging direct, and it speaks directly to Christians. Quran chapter 4, verse 171, O people of the book, do not exaggerate in your religion. And then it's clear it's speaking to Christians, not to Jews, because it goes on to say that indeed Isa ben Maryam, Jesus, the son of Mary, was only this and that. So that's another sort of, when you put those things together, it's very impressive to me. And the book, people make their own judgment if they read the book. Yeah, and then your point about the location of the Paleo-Arabic monotheistic inscriptions is another good one. So another great challenge, important. Two things to say about that. One is that we're getting closer and closer. So together with Haytham Sidki, someone else I should mention, Ahmed Jalad and Haytham Sidki have published on two inscriptions that are very close in two separate inscriptions, in two separate locations. And one of those two locations is in Ta'if. So the famous city that Muhammad would, by tradition, visited, supposed to be a center for the worship of one of the pagan goddesses, but we've now found a Paleo-Arabic inscription there, which is monotheistic and seems to date right from the dawn of Islam. So we are getting closer. That's one point. And then the second point is, you've already made it. But as for Mecca itself, well, it's just no one is able to do any sort of surveys of Mecca. The city of Mecca, by the way, and its connection, this is kind of controversial territory, but its connection or its place in the story of Islam's emergence in the traditional story, I mean, for me, there's still some questions to be answered there. So I wouldn't say, that people should bet the house on, beginning to do surveys in Mecca. The Quran, has just very kind of obscure references to Mecca, and there's more to be said on that.
Yeah, actually, it's funny because I think I seem to recall Stephen Shoemaker, another controversial revisionist scholar, making the same point, that the interest in Mecca seems to have increased over time in the history of Islam, and that the earliest sources seem to have almost nothing to say about it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I tend to be pretty cautious because I think there are reasons to defend the idea that Islam began in Mecca. So I'm kind of in the middle, undecided, all of this. But for those who would say, like, not so fast, I mean, the first point is that Mecca does not exist on any map or in any chronicle, period, before the Quran. No one mentions it. No one. No Latin writer, no Greek writer, no Syriac writer, no Hebrew Jewish source, Ethiopic, nothing, right? So that's a problem, especially because the traditional stories are that the Quraysh, the main tribe in Mecca, were these international merchant, traders who had developed this massive wealth and were connected everywhere because Mecca was not only a center for trade, but was, this cultic center because of the Kaaba. So why is no one speaking about this caravan of Meccan traders showed up in our city today? We have lots of those kind of reports of other cities and other people or people groups. So, I mean, you can start there, and then there's other things that could be said as well. Yeah, I mean, I do not agree with the idea that Stephen Shoemaker, that he's actually more cautious. People sometimes caricature his argument, but the idea that the origins of Islam are probably further to the north, meaning like Jordan, Palestine, and closer to the time of the end of the 7th century. I don't agree with that, but maybe we can
Mhm.
talk about it if you want. It could
Yeah.
be a topic.
Yeah, I think Nikolai Sinai alludes to a similar point. In one of his chapters on the Quran, a historical critical introduction, he mentions the fact that a lot of the references in the Quran point to like an agricultural slash pastoral
Right,
context, which
right.
doesn't fit in well with what Mecca
That's
is like.
another really good point. Yeah, so that's originally Patricia Crona's point, not in
Mhm,
Hagarism, but in an
mhm,
article she wrote towards the end of her career called something simple. I mean, someone might put it in the comments, but it's something like,
mhm.
"What did the Meccan pagans do for a living?" And she's like, "Listen, these in the so-called Meccan surahs, the opponents of Muhammad, they're growing grapes, they've got fig trees, they have big livestock, not just like goats, but they have cows." And like, this is not the case in Mecca today. And then she very carefully goes to the climate data of what Mecca would have been like in the 7th century, so that no one can say, oh, but environmental change, all this. It was not the case in the 7th century either. It couldn't have supported those kinds of things. So that's pretty interesting argument, and people have pushed back. She does have a tendency, great scholar, but she does have a tendency to almost set up the problem as though it's kind of a mathematical problem, like a problem set
Mhm.
that, if you just get all the sort of, I'm not good at math, but if you get all the sort of data in there, then you just have to work out the formulas and you get your answer. And it's undeniable.
Yeah.
It's what a lawyer say, QED or something.
Yeah, unfortunately, ancient history writing is never that precise. There's a
Exactly.
lot of gaps that you need to fill in, and different
Yeah.
scholars have different ideas of how to fill in the gaps. Yeah, and I guess that's what we're doing with Mecca. Now, on a related note, you talked about the Quran's interest in Christians and Christianity. So, if memory serves, the bulk of the references to Christians occur in surahs Al-Baqarah, Al-Imran, An-Nisa, Al-Ma'idah, At-Tawbah. And one of the interesting things I note about all those surahs is that they're all classified as Medinan surahs. So it seems that Muhammad's interest in Christianity, if we're to take the traditional chronology, really began during his Medinan phase. And during his Meccan phase, he wasn't nearly as interested in Christians. Um, how does that factor into your overall thesis?
Yeah. So if it's okay, Luis, great question. That's really important. And, Nikolai Sinai has developed that quite a bit, identifying what's this. So one of the, very impressive arguments that Nikolai makes is there are both from his point of view, there are both literary qualities of Medinan passages. So those passages proclaimed by Muhammad according to tradition in the city of Medina, and certain topics that only come up. So both on literary stylistic terms and on sort of substantive terms of the topic or subject at hand, these things correlate. So whenever you
Mhm.
have certain subjects, you have those literary characteristics. Now, he has something called the Medinan constellation, where these different subjects appear in passages that have certain literary qualities. And very very impressive argument. Nevertheless, nevertheless, for me personally, and Nikolai's smarter than I am, so it could be I haven't thought through this clearly enough, and someday I'll have to eat humble pie. But nevertheless, I for me, I take a step back, and to me, it's very important to think
Mhm.
about the nature of Quranic style throughout, and to ask yourself, does this seem to be a transcript of something someone said? So I like with my students, but generally, even it comes out in the book as well. Like that's a starting point. Like, do people speak this way? Is this something that would have been said? And a million things could be made to advance the point that what we have is not a simple transcript. Like, Muhammad on a Wednesday afternoon at 2 p.m. was on this street in Mecca in the year 617 in the spring, and he said these sentences, and they were never changed until the year 650 when Uthman wrote it down, the third caliph, right? Like that, people assume that's how it is, and they're like, well, this is what Muhammad said in 617 in Mecca. Or this is what the opponents of Muhammad said. They said, I don't know, قلوبنا غلف in Medina, our hearts are covered. Like the Jews said that, and that's an exact quotation. Now, one thing just to point out about this is that almost without exception, I mean, there's like 99% of the statements attributed to the opponents of Muhammad are when a group is speaking. There's only like 2 or 3 exceptions where you actually have one individual says something. It's always قالوا المشركون or قالوا اليهود or قالوا. So it's always a group speaking. قال الذين كفروا, something like this. So we imagine like a little crowd speaking in chorus, in unison, these Arabic words. Okay, more needs to be said, and people could push back against this, but at least for a thought experiment, if you accept that this does not appear to be a transcript of what was said in Mecca on a Wednesday afternoon or something like this, then you can begin to differentiate between what I would call the, again, I'm sure there's a better way, but Zitz and Laban, so the historical context of Muhammad's personal career. I'm not denying Muhammad existed. The man Muhammad, his career, that's one Zitz and Laban. That's one historical context. And then you have another Zitz and Laban, which is the time of the composition of the Qur'an, when this very stylistic, rhyming Arabic was composed, where one of the features was the opponents of Muhammad will always speak as a group, as the Jews, the pagans, the Christians. It's never, I don't know, Samir ibn Wisam, one man. You never have that, right? So you have another Zitz and Laban where the guys who actually composed the Quran in the Arabic we have now, who had certain concerns, and I could speak more about that, that are reflected in the nature of the Arabic text. This is a different Zitz and Laban from the original Zitz and Laban of Muhammad, the man who was living in Mecca and Medina. I'm sorry, this is, I kind of went on a tangent because you're asking me specifically about the Christians. But just to say that, like, I kind of take a rain check on that question, because I wouldn't read Medinan passages as the passages that were proclaimed between 622 and 632 in Medina. And I wouldn't read the Meccan passages as the passages that were proclaimed similarly between 610 and 622 in Mecca.
Okay. Yeah. So far we've talked about Quranic references to biblical stories, and to Christians. There's one other piece of evidence that I wanted to get your thoughts on that, in my opinion, doesn't get enough discussion. So, in the past few years, what I've done is I tried to read up as much as I can on the hadiths, the canonical Sunni collections. And one of the things that I noticed is that there are a lot of quotes by Muhammad that sound suspiciously like quotes from the New Testament. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. So in Sahih Muslim 2569, the Prophet gives this story about, how God will ask people on the day of resurrection, why did you not feed me, or why did you not give me drink when I was thirsty? And it sounds suspiciously like the parable of the sheep and the goats. And there's another one in Jamia Tirmidhi 3197, and I'll just quote it because it's very interesting. And the Prophet says, Allah Most High says, I prepared for my righteous worshippers what no eye has seen, no ear has heard, and no human heart has conceived. And that, to me, sounds suspiciously like 1 Corinthians 2:9, where St. Paul is describing what the resurrection is like. So could these quotes be evidence that, the early hadith compilers, they were familiar with these Christian traditions from the New Testament, and they were trying to basically put it in the mouth of Muhammad, as it were, to make him sound more profound? What are your thoughts?
Well, certainly the compilers are turning to Christian traditions. I mean, it's amazing to have, for example, something from St. Paul, just to sort of double down for your viewers on how interesting and intriguing the second of the two. I mean, the first one from Matthew is already really intriguing, but the second one from 1 Corinthians, I mean, So there you have a statement that we have in a letter of St. Paul, which, I think he actually says, as it is written. So there's a big, in New Testament studies, there's lots of, back and forth about that passage. But anyway, in the hadith, it's not a normal hadith because it's presented, as you know, as God's words and not Muhammad's words, right? So he's saying, I have, so that's already, and I think in First Corinthians, it's not divine speech. What no eye has seen, no ear has heard, what has been stored up for those who love him, or something. It's kind of third person. So here you have what's known as hadith Qudsi, God himself speaking, but in the hadith, not in the Qur'an. But this is like, Bulus al-Mal'un, the accursed Paul, who is the nemesis in all of the Islamic accounts of the corruption of Christianity. The guy who, deified Jesus, who invented the notion of grace and the abolition of the law, all the things that Muslims ascribe to Paul. Now, this stuff probably wasn't totally in the air already when the hadith is being compiled, but it's just so strange to see then, this hadith where Allah is using the words of Paul. So, yeah, I mean, basically, the hadith is like this massive avalanche of traditions that, appear really, I mean, kind of in the 8th century, but really in the early 9th century. Ibn Hanbal has one of the first collections, and then you have Bukhari, who dies in 870, is kind of number one, and Muslim dies a few years later, is number two. So you just have this avalanche of traditions that basically are responding to the need of the Islamic community for guidance. The Qur'an, of course, is a book of guidance for Muslims, but it's very, very short. I mean, it's just very, here's a standard mushaf. It's just very short. It's about 65% of the New Testament, and it's filled with exhortations and some stories, but it doesn't give, a lot of that kind of stuff, and it doesn't give other kinds of stuff about law, basically, what is forbidden, what is permitted. So you have this massive, tidal wave of these hadith, and they're coming from everywhere, including from Christian traditions.
Yes, that would make a lot of sense. So I only have a couple more questions that I have, and then maybe if Michael has any ones, he can throw them in. One has to do with the idea of Islam as a Christian heresy. So, historically, that was how a lot of early Christian writers saw it. For example, John of Damascus. And then there's a lot of these talk about how, Muhammad got his ideas from Bahira the monk, or maybe from Waraka bin Nawfal. So how does the research in your book relate to this idea of Islam as a Christian heresy, if they relate in any way?
Yeah, great. So from historical terms, I think most people would say, the category of heresy is probably not one, historian, sort of secular, historically, critically minded folks should use, because, it assumes that there's an orthodoxy, and, as, serious scholars, critical scholars, there should be no such thing. So that's kind of the easy way out. There's no such thing as heresy. Everything is heresy, or everything is orthodoxy, or everything's meaningless, whatever. So from a theological point of view, so as a Catholic, for example, my understanding of the category of heresy absolutely excludes Islam from this category. So, if we use, famously someone like Arius as a heresiarch, what Arius does is seek to co-opt, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael or Luis, in my take on Arius, but as I understand, he seeks to co-opt the deposit of faith or the apostolic tradition for his own sort of ideas of how things really should be, right? So that, to me, that's heresy. You're trying to hijack the deposit of faith given to the church by the apostles, and that is a certain kind of perfidy and danger to the church. And then you have, other competing religious systems, and I would put Islam in that category.
Yeah. So actually, on that note, I remember a while ago somebody wrote a Brill book on John of Damascus on Islam, and one of the things they noted is that in the early church, there seemed to have been two definitions of heresy. There was like a narrow definition that only concerned deviations from orthodoxy, but
Okay.
then there was like a broader broader idea of heresy that encompassed any religious idea that goes against Orthodox Christianity. So you can lump in things like Platonism or Judaism or
Mhm.
Islam, for that matter,
Yeah,
in that
yeah.
broad category.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I guess it's
Yeah.
really key to define the terms carefully
Mhm.
in that sort of. And I mean, it's worth adding as well that,
Mhm.
sometimes folks will say, well, yeah,
Mhm.
this or that is a heresy, but I don't mean it in a bad way.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just think it's important to be attentive to our social context, and certain terms
Mhm.
are not just conveying information, but they have a
Mhm.
vibe, right? And,
Yeah.
heresy has a bad vibe. So personally, I would stay away.
Mhm. Yeah, and a lot of the medieval Christians who made that argument against Islam usually paired it with the idea that Muhammad's ideas were given to him by heretical Christian
Totally.
monks,
100%.
such as
Yeah.
Bahira.
Yeah. Yep.
So, actually, how much historical credence would you give to some of those episodes involving Bahira or Waraka bin
Zero.
Nawfal?
Zero.
Zero. Okay, so you don't think they're historically accurate.
No,
Got it.
not at all.
Okay. Now, one last question that I want to toss out. It has to do with the kind of Christianity that existed in Arabia.
Mhm.
This is one of the questions that I go back and forth on. So, like, what was the dominant form of Christianity there? There seemed to have been some evidence that, for example, the Najran community may have been some form of Miaphysite.
Mhm.
And I've
Mhm.
also heard theories that um, Khadija, his first wife, was a Coloridian or an Ebionite. What are your thoughts on the types of Christianity that Muhammad was likely encountering and influenced by?
Yeah. So folks love the idea that there's some exotic
Hmm.
Christian sect or movement. There's this idea that, the desert would be a good place. I mean, people just go on instinct sometimes with this stuff, like, it's far away from like the religious police of Byzantium. Therefore, this
Hmm.
or that heresy, must have emerged there. There is no evidence, certainly no compelling evidence, for any of
Hmm.
these exotic heresies that are mentioned by Epiphanius centuries earlier and stuff. There's nothing. There's nothing. Good kind of clear historical research, and I'd recommend to folks Jack Tanous and his book The Making of the Medieval Middle East, but also the work that David Bertena has done. He has a really good article in the Journal of the
Hmm.
International Quranic Studies Association, JICSA, on tritheism within the Miaphysite community and accusations surrounding John Philoponus. Clearly among Arabic speakers, Miaphysitism, so what became known as Jacobites in Arab, so Yaqubiyid in Arabic sources, but so the Miaphysites were the dominant community among Arabic speaking Christians, and there's diversity within there as well. There are different positions among the Miaphysites, but there's every reason to think that Arabic speakers really en masse had above all become Miaphysite Christians, and probably your viewers, they're really good with Christology and all that stuff. But just to say, so this is the community which is mainstream part of the apostolic churches, but deviates or
Hmm.
disagrees with Chalcedon, so one of the
Yeah.
non-Chalcedonian Christian movement.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the main patrons of the South Arabian Christians was the Aksumite Empire, which
Right,
was
right,
Miaphysite.
right,
Although I
totally.
remember there was also an offhand comment uh, in Ibn Ishaq about how the Najran community was also being patronized by the Byzantines, which would be odd if the Najran Christians held to a form of Christianity that the Byzantines would have found heretical.
Well, this is not my territory exactly, but I do think that there has been a sort of exaggerated notion about hostility and animosity
Hmm.
between the Byzantine, ruling class and the Miaphysites. And actually, there's a lot more harmony in cooperation. Periods where the church in Constantinople not only permitted but encouraged the appointment of Mophosite bishops, and then direct cooperation, for example, with the Ethiopians and the church in Egypt as well, which was also Mophosite. So yeah, I mean, there are other points as well about the presence of Mophosites in South Arabia, including Jacob of Sarug famously writes a letter in Syriac, which is interesting too, called the Letter to the Himyarites. So he's, a Mophosite, late church father who is engaging with the Christians of Southern Arabia.
Okay, very interesting. So that's all of the questions I have. So maybe if Michael has any follow-up
Yeah.
he wants to ask.
Yeah, I do, if you don't mind, if you have just a few
Sure.
moments here. So
Yeah,
you
yeah,
mentioned
I've got like 5-10 minutes maybe, if that's okay.
Okay,
Mike?
so we'll do a lightning round. Real quick, you mentioned there Epiphanius, not testifying to exotic Christianities in that territory. Of course, he's writing a couple hundred years before Muhammad.
Okay.
So, could it be that maybe after that time you had maybe some coming into that territory, but maybe it's just not preserved in the historical record as much as perhaps Nicene Orthodox Christian sources would be? Because, of course, Nicene Orthodox Christians would, obviously tend to preserve Orthodox sources more than something heretical in nature. I know that might be more of an argument from silence kind of thing, but what do you think of that, about that?
I think so a really important point, right? Because, there could be just sort of a intentional setting aside of this or that community. Although, the history of heresiographies kind of suggests that people like to find heresy so they can condemn them. Like people like to find, I don't know, opponents in their workplace so they can talk about them or something like that. So yeah, I mean, there's really no evidence for the presence of these groups in the 6th or 7th century Hejaz. And it's important to keep in mind that this gets complicated because you can find early Christian references to this or that going on in Arabia. And as you probably both know, there are 3 different Arabian provinces in Roman and later Byzantine parlance. And so you have Arabia Petraea, which is basically the modern day country of Jordan. Then you have Arabia Deserta, which is southern Jordan, southern Palestine, and now most of what is Saudi Arabia. And then you have Arabia Felix, which is basically Yemen. And almost all the references to Arabia are actually just Arabia Petraea. So they're speaking about, like, when Paul goes, I forget I should know which biblical book, there's a report of Paul going to stay among the Arabs. It's certainly Arabia Petraea, that reference. So he's going, off to, Amman, Jordan, which was Philadelphia back then. So yeah, and the thing though, I guess, Michael, that's really maybe important to keep in mind, however, is that even if there was no sort of organized heresy with maybe its own bishop or something like that, that doesn't mean that there weren't like all sorts of wild ideas among self-professing Christians, Arabic speakers, right? Like, go to any, I don't know, Starbucks today and start asking folks what they think about, was Jesus human, divine? How do these go together? You'll get crazy answers. So.
Yeah, you go and poll Catholics, they're not going to be Orthodox in their theology. Yeah. So I mean, but how would you then account for the fact that it appears the Qur'an in some cases is engaging non-Orthodox Christianities? In some cases, it looks like it's addressing a Monophysite or maybe even other views. It has to be speaking to some kind of audience. Is it maybe that it was addressing Orthodox Christians who were supposed to be Nicene and Chalcedonian, but they held to deviant views just because of their ignorance?
Yeah, great question. So you do have passages, famously Quran chapter 5, verse 116, which has, God speak to Jesus and say, did you tell people, quote, take me and my mother as 2 gods apart from God? Or you have passages which speak of God taking, ittakhadha is the Arabic word, taking a son. That's not Orthodox language, for the relationship between God the Father and God the Son. Begetting instead, so it's not taking, which seems to be, is that adoptionist? Because you kind of adopt, take. Yeah, I mean, I would just say, and people could, I guess, push back and say you're avoiding the question, but I would just say, like, The Quran is not sort of like a simple, careful, systematic uh, text, which sort of soberly identifies the subject it's addressing, gives it a fair shake, and then analyzes one, two, three about it. Right? The Quran is interested in advancing its own case. It's willing to use hyperbole, exaggeration, satire. It's very artistic. It's doing its best to use what it calls emthal, which are proverbs or parables. It's kind of very like dynamic, artistic, satirical. Sometimes it's very kind of aggressive in its polemic, in sort of insulting views it doesn't like. So yeah, it's hard to make clear conclusions based on the data of the Quran in terms of its conversation partners.
All right, and real quick, I think if you had answered this before and I mentioned it, I apologize. There was something that you were mentioning there about Jahiliyyah in the,
Right.
over there in Arabia,
Yeah.
and you mentioned that there appears to be a lack of pagan inscriptions
Yeah.
around the time period of Muhammad. Now, do you think, however, it would be reasonable to say that those probably would not have survived, given the Sahaba likely would have just destroyed these things?
Oh, great point. Well, I mean, I guess the first counter argument would be the earlier ones do survive.
Okay.
So we do have loads of pagan inscriptions, generally for the northern ones, generally classified with this term Safa'idic. So yeah, we have tens of thousands of them that date from, the dating, I guess, can be contested, but I would just take refuge in Ahmad al-Jalad instead of trying to produce the arguments myself. So we have 3rd, 4th century, even earlier pagan inscriptions. So those did survive. So it shows that, yeah, they weren't sort of, any trace of paganism wasn't systematically erased. Yeah, there's other counter arguments folks make, and just to say there were pagans still in the Middle East, but they were up north in what is today Turkey, around the city of Haran and some other places, and that they continue on quite late, to the 9th, 10th century in the Middle East. But the pagan inscriptions in Arabia itself disappeared.
And one last one, just to kind of steel man the position that would be, I think, critical of your thesis.
Yeah.
You're saying that some of these stories about Christianity in Arabia are later stories. So if that were the case, and these stories maybe come out of nowhere and they're not based on any kind of oral tradition, wouldn't the Islamic community at the time had just said, "Hey, where did these stories come from? We've never heard of this," and they would have kind of been able to spot a fake account or something?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say it's a great question. I guess I would say every story has to start somewhere.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, people around Halloween would speak about the headless horseman, which I think was the story told about something in upstate New York or something. Like, I had to come from somewhere, the headless horseman. So that's one point. But then, more importantly, we have signs of a complete interruption of the transmission of knowledge. And I'll give one simple example of this, and that's the famous disconnected or mysterious letters. So 29 of the 114 chapters of the Quran begin with letters. They're not words. I can't make them into words. They're just letters. And if you read, the earliest commentaries, no one has any idea what they are. And usually the answer, and this is very common among Dawah folks today, is simply, well, God knows best. They're known only to God. And for this or that reason, he wanted to include it in the Quran. So, I mean, in fact, we know that they do mean something, because now Western scholars have been able to identify certain patterns in the letters. Maybe that's for another episode. But, presumably when Muhammad or the first composers used these letters, they knew what they were. And then you get around to the first commentaries, in the late 8th century, that knowledge is lost. So there is reason to think that there was a complete interruption in the transmission of knowledge from Islam's origins.
All right, thank you for that. I mean, there's so many more questions, but I want to be respectful to your time. I'm really looking forward to the book coming out in September. I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes, an Amazon link. Also, where can people go to find out more about your content?
I mean, thank you, Mike. It's very kind. You're very generous. I just mentioned my humble little YouTube channel, Exploring the Quran and the Bible. So everyone's welcome to check it out.
Thank you so much. You are always welcome to come back on. Always honored to have you, and I appreciate your time and generosity.
Thank you.
Everybody, thank y'all so much for watching. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. See you later.